a piece of my work. So what I do at the Litecoin Foundation in my role as creative director and one of the directors of the foundation is I do a lot of branding. I do a lot of strategy. So strategy from, in terms of actually looking at who the addressable market is, who the target audience are for certain projects, things in our ecosystem. I do simplifying. That's a strange word to have up on the screen, but I talk to very, very smart people who aren't the best communicators. And what I try and do is I try and translate as if it were for me. Another thing is I'm non-technical. I understand technical stuff to an extent, not as well as some people, but what I do is I try to translate things into the non-technical because selfishly, I'm non-technical. And then lastly, I love going off on tangents. It's a little joke because I haven't gone off on so many tangents, but later on you'll understand what I'm talking about, yeah? So, why did I do the branding for Litecoin? This was the first job that I did for Litecoin, or the Litecoin Foundation rather. Being a decentralized currency, you can't really do a job for that, but it's because of this. So if you look up there, that's all the core releases up until about 2021, I think, or yeah, 2021 most likely. And the blue is where I come in. Before that, it had different logos. So what I wanted to do was actually bring a bit of maturity to the brand, consolidate the thinking, and actually have something which was universally looked at a little bit more professional. How did I do it? I didn't really understand the space that well. I'd been investing since 2015, so I flew to San Francisco, tapped Charlie Lee on the shoulder and asked, could I present this brand to you? And he was like, it's a decentralized currency, and I said, I know that. And he said, you can show it to me, but the community has to accept it. Luckily, the community accepted it. So that's why I'm here today in my capacity as creative director and the director of Litecoin Foundation. They thought I did a decent job, so they asked me on. Now, I'm going to get to what I'm talking about today, which is much more interesting than talking about me. Financial privacy. So I wanted to chuck in a couple of meme visuals just for interest, and I know a lot of people from Casper and that. Why would you care about financial privacy? So if you think about it, the situations where you'd use cash, for instance, why would you use cash? Is it under the counter? Is it being paid under the counter? Is it paying a babysitter? Like I paid a babysitter the other day. And if I paid a babysitter the other day using something like a CBDC, which I'm about to talk about, that could be surveilled, that could be traced and programmed as program money. It could be traced back to the babysitter, and all of a sudden they start losing central payments, which they're trying to avoid. I'm not saying it's right, but what I'm saying is that's a use case. But there's also other use cases. Globally, we're really lucky in Australia where it's like, when you use cash for a few purposes, and whenever I drive past someone who's pulling out $350 from an ATM at like 11 o'clock at night, I tend to know it's not for a babysitter, right? Cocaine. Yeah, cocaine. So, illicit drugs, there's other naughty things as well that you want to keep private. You know, it might be buying a sex toy. I don't know if anyone wants to do a hands up about who owns a sex toy. No, that's great, never works, but thanks for chatting. That's because of privacy. You don't want to tell me. You all own sex toys. Lots of them. And also, what about gifts? Hiding gifts from loved ones. I mean, these are all really first world problems, right? But elsewhere in the world, the consequences are a little bit more dire. This guy's great. I don't know how many of you know what PGP is or pretty good privacy, but it was invented by this man, Phil Zimmerman. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Phil a couple of times, and he's very smart, and he's possibly one of, I'd say, the best translators from the technical to the non-technical. But he says this, and I think it's quite an apt quotation. So he says, show me a person who has nothing to hide, and I'll show you a person who is either exceedingly dull or a complete exhibitionist. So I don't know whether we want to do an exhibitionist raise your hand thing, but I guess what he's trying to get at there is that, you know, either we live the most boring lives on earth, or we like to live them completely in the open. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to keep my sex toys to myself, okay? So I'm actually the former. So think about it, what are you hiding in your life? And I'm not asking, this sounds so much like, sorry, I've just woken up, had a coffee, and now I sound like I'm selling a pyramid scheme, which I'm not. Other people are. Won't name names. But what would your money look like? What are you hiding? What would it look like if someone could actually look behind the curtain and see what you're spending your money on, right? And I used this slide a couple of times, and I promise you, this is the only slide that I regurgitate. But it would look like this, right? Whoop. With my face on it, right? But the Australian, I couldn't Photoshop in time, okay? Just relax, okay? And also the last time I did this was in Nashville, so it was more relevant. But if I really, really wanted to show the world what my money would look like, it would look more like this, right? Rolled up with a bit of residue on it, okay? The reality is, I don't want people knowing what I'm doing with my money, to some extent. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But what about if we were faced with the situation where, quite honestly, we didn't have a choice? So enter CBDCs. I don't know, I actually want you to raise your hands. How many people know what a CBDC is, or a central bank digital currency? Excellent, so I can kind of skip over the sort of beginner intro, and it'll become obvious in a second anyway. But one of the really interesting things that's been happening, and by interesting I mean terrifying, is that I guess even the looming CBDC. So in Australia, fortunately, the pilot of our CBDC absolutely tanked. So we trashed tens of millions of dollars trying to create a digital currency for us, central bank, and it absolutely tanked. So they binned that pilot and they're trying again. So fortunately in Australia, we're probably not going to see a CBDC for a few years, if ever, who knows. But globally, freedom's at an all-time low. So I love this index. It's called the Index of Economic Freedom. And it looks at a whole range of things, but one of the things it really focuses on is financial privacy and financial autonomy. And I guess that's pretty relevant to why we're here today. So it's at a 23-year low. So it surveys 180 countries, and it shows that there's like 5 countries that are not lower than last decade. And overall, we're at a 23-year low. So out of 100, it scores out of 100, like a lot of things. The average across the board is 58 out of 100. So that's not good. One of the things I wanted to show you, and I made this slide, thank you very much, or the graph. A lot of people don't worry about it. Economic freedom in 2024. You can see down here there's a few lines. So the blue line, that is Australia. The grey line is New Zealand. I don't know if there are any New Zealanders in the audience, like the smarter Australians. China, I bet you can guess which one that is, and Venezuela. And what that looks like is it looks over from 1996 to 2024, and it charts every single year of the sentiment and I guess the calculations that they're using with their methodology and research materials of what economic freedom looks like in those countries. So hilariously, Australia hasn't changed at all, right? But that's because nothing really has changed. If you look at other metrics, there are a lot of metrics about trust. There's a lot of metrics about, would I trust my bank with my data? Would I trust my bank to actually have a network which didn't go down all the time? Those metrics are very low. But this overarching economic freedom metric, it's high because we do have financial liberty here to some extent. And also, the economy is not screwed as badly as elsewhere in the world. But it's not going to last for long if this happens. So CBDCs, I'm sure you've heard this stat before, but 138 countries are currently piloting their central bank digital currency, and those countries make up 98% of the world's GDP. So that's pretty substantial if you think about it. So they're kind of the most powerful of the 138 of the most powerful countries. Like I said before, thankfully Australia tanked the prototype, but I guess about 80% of you raised your hand and said you knew what a CBDC was. But I'll just cover this off very quickly. If you look at the threats of a CBDC, it's like there's 4 real main ones in my mind, right? There's the real-time tracking and monitoring of transactions. So one of the things that you can see is like an unprecedented access to people's financial activities and their whereabouts. And so if you think about where you are in the world, and let's just say I'm in China, which I was a couple of months ago, okay? There's 600 cameras, right? For every square meter, that's what they say. And I don't know whether that's included in smartphones and all that kind of stuff. But 600 cameras seems a bit rich, but it is a really well-surveilled country, and by well-surveilled I mean haven't had that for a long time, since karaoke last night, you know what I mean? Yeah? What's your karaoke tune? Do you want me to smash it? Don't worry about it. Let's stay on track, okay? See, tangents. See that? A few laughs, loving it. You're loving it. Big time. But I guess I'm not a comedian. I'm not trying to be a comedian. I don't know what I'm doing here. But that's a real problem, the real-time monitoring of transactions. The other thing is data collection. So you think about breaching of privacy and the fact that pretty much every company in Australia is tanked in terms of their responsibility of looking after our data. Is that a hand up? No, great. Okay, just checking. I don't know whether you were responsible for some data leakage or something, but no, I'm joking, no. But you look at Telstra, you look at Optus, you look at basically anyone. Just think of a marquee name in Australia, a household name, and they've leaked our data, okay? But this is worse. So, because it's programmable money and because they have ultimate surveillance over the transactions and your history and what you're doing with it, they can trace where you are, they can trace what you're doing, who you're sending money to, your political beliefs, all those kinds of things. The data is actually a lot more valuable, and it's a lot more scary if, I don't know, falls into the wrong hands. No cash, no privacy, you know what I mean? Remember that rolled up note? One use case, but there's plenty of others, right? Already we're seeing a really, I guess, hard push towards a cashless society, and everyone's been saying that for a long time, but 30% less cash in the Australian economy already. So that's pretty substantial, and I know a lot of you probably have wads under your bed and stuff like that. My kids stole mine. But cash is important for anonymity, and like I mentioned before. And then social credit scores. Fortunate enough not to have them in Australia, but to some extent, they do exist in the Western world. But obviously the biggest, or best example of a social credit score or a system or rating is in China. And I'll talk about that in a second. But this is one of those things which is, it's not just affecting your financial freedom and your liberties with who you send money to, what you contribute money to, but it also might have a knock-on effect on how you're perceived by the government and therefore access to things like healthcare. So this is a fun little slide, right? There's a dude on the left, that's my right, yeah, and he's got someone behind him just choking him. But in some countries, if you use your money to buy gay porn, you're done, right? You're locked up, you're beaten up, you might even die. And that's a sad state of affairs when, you know, like it or not, people should be able to love who they want. And in some countries, you die for that. Politics. I mean, we live in a democracy, and that's great. US is sort of a democracy, and then a lot of other places in the world are not democracies. The autocracies, the dictatorships, the nation states that don't necessarily have the democratic rights and freedoms that our citizens do. That's a problem. If you contribute to the wrong political party or campaign or person, who knows, you could end up in jail, you could end up on death row. Bad habits. If you've got bad habits like gambling, if you've got bad habits like I mentioned before, drug taking, if you've got bad habits like buying bipolar medication, that actually affects your social credit score. That's a problem for me. I'm mental, right? I buy so many medications, I look like a pharmacy myself, right? That's not good. That wouldn't be good for my social credit score in China, for instance. And then total surveillance. Like I mentioned before, there's a plethora of cameras for every single individual around there, and if they want, they can turn your computer, your phone, your fridge, your TV into a camera, into a listening device, into some sort of surveillance. The last thing we need, and the last, I guess, piece of the puzzle, is our money, them being able to surveil our money. So, again, fortunately, Australia not doing so well. What do CBDCs promise that might actually see some adoption, and some of the research reports are actually seeing that there's positive sentiment towards CBDCs? Well, the big proof points are faster settlements and transaction times. So a lot of this for remittance payments overseas, but also like getting paid. The other thing is they promise cheaper, faster remittance payments. Sure, absolutely. I mean, technically we have a tokenised banking system and have had for about 5 or 6 years, which is through the line across the world. Could be free and instantaneous already, but I mean, the banks, right? And that's kind of it for upside. Imagine if something like this already existed. It does. Oh, whoops. Subliminal. It wasn't as quick as I wanted it to be. But Things like that already exist. You're here at a cryptocurrency conference or a digital currency or block, I'm not sure how it's billed. There are a lot of currencies here, and they do those things quite well. A lot of them better than others. And I would say, and I'm not just doing this because I'm wearing a great t-shirt and creative director of Litecoin Foundation, but Litecoin does it best in terms of acting like a silver to Bitcoin's gold. But CBDCs are safe, right? It's a bit of a rhetorical question and you don't have to answer. Well, they're not. Like, look at this. So I know it's issued by the central bank. Fortunately, our central bank, the pilot, couldn't even get off the ground. But also, our banking system, the rails we use, and this is globally as well, suck. They're down all the time. Last night I was like, I better just double check if anything's happened. There were 2 outages last night in Australia, ANZ. It's crazy. And so if you could probably count on the number of hands in this room. No, it's probably about 120 hands. Less. Basically on my fingers, right? How many times a bank in Australia hasn't failed? That's not really an eloquent sentence, and I wouldn't quote me on that. That doesn't make any sense. Last night, though, you probably heard of a lot of Ethereum killers and Bitcoin killers, and I'm sure you've walked around and a lot of people have said that. And maybe this dude at the party last night said, shitcoin's going to be the next big thing, which is something that I overheard last night, and I'm replacing shit with something else. But there are a lot of people out there that are promising similar things to the CBDC and similar things to actual genuine and robust projects in the space. These are just some examples of the chains that are in the top 20 that have regular network outages, some more regular than others. Solana is hilarious. No offense to anyone here who uses Solana, but Solana is hilarious. I love looking at the network activity, and I love looking at how often the network is actually running smoothly. It's hilarious, and if anyone's from Solana here, I'd love to talk to you, because I'm missing a laugh. That's hilarious. There's Sui, there's this ton thing which didn't exist when I was interested, Polygon, all these chains, right? And then you've got Litecoin, and no one thinks Litecoin's very sexy, even though I'm standing here, thanks very much. But it's not sexy, I kind of agree. It does its job, and it does its job really well. It's got 13 years uptime, 300 million transactions processed flawlessly, and I don't mean like, let's call them, what rhymes with Tron? I just ruined it. Not like Tron, where they claim to have all these transactions and not necessarily processed, and I've got a few shaking heads, so maybe I'll move on. Also, their average transaction fee is super low, and this has actually taken over 13 years. This is not taken over 3 days, it's not cherry-picked from August, it's not cherry-picked from January. This is lifetime. So, over its entire lifetime, 0.0005 US cents to send any amount of Litecoin anywhere in the world, anytime. So, I'm getting there. What's Litecoin got to do with digital currency, digital privacy? Well, like I mentioned before, imagine if something like the CBDC, but not an evil version, existed. And imagine if you had something which actually afforded you the relative privacy that you needed. Litecoin has that. So in 2022, after many years of I guess, hashing it out, for lack of a better term, MWeb was launched. So MWeb stands for Mimblewimble Extension Box. Now, you're not going to hear me use that acronym because it doesn't make sense and I don't watch Harry Potter. But in effect, what it does is it adopts Mimblewimble, which is, I think it was produced in 2017 by a guy called Thomas Judisa, who wrote the white paper, and it was adopted by Grin and Beam blockchains. Anyway, we then brought that across to Litecoin, and what it does is it affords you relative privacy. So it's basically opt-in confidential transactions. It obfuscates either the sending and receiving address or how much you're sending or receiving. So it's quite handy. Now, why have I got this little slide of me in green pants, different green pants by the way, I have a very extensive wardrobe. But this is me in China a couple of months ago, and this is when an idea kicked off. I love the technology I just mentioned, MWeb, right? But try explaining it to someone in less than 5 minutes, or even 30 minutes. I've been trying to do it since 2022. Well, I was trying to explain it to this guy, Mr. Zhang. I have a knack for finding gangsters anywhere I go. I really like gangsters. He's a gangster. I went on his motorbike. Anyway, long story short, he was talking to me about VPNs and how to stay safe from surveillance in China and all these sorts of things. It was very fascinating. And I mentioned MWeb to him, and he said, I'd love to use it in China. I'd love to be able to send money and obfuscate he didn't say it like this, but how much I'm sending and to whom I'm actually sending it, receiving, or sending address. So we had a few cigarettes and a few soda waters, and he recommended NordVPN. And I was already using NordVPN, but that's what he uses as well. And I started thinking about what a VPN is, and I thought about all the nodes around the world, and I thought about Nord in particular, and where their servers are, and where how distributed they are across the world. And I'm not sure how many of you know what a VPN actually does, but a study said 90% of people know that it changes your IP address. Verbatim is what they say. Basically, you can pretend like you're elsewhere very quickly, because I've only got 6 minutes. 1.6 billion people use a VPN, and that's crazy. And the reasons they use it differ quite a bit, but that's 33% of the internet's users. That's crazy, and that stat is as of August this year. So they use it to combat censorship of information. So if you're in a certain country and they're restricting your access to international media or commentary, or even X, I've never said that, Twitter, whatever, in Brazil, like that was crazy. Censoring Twitter in Brazil, that was crazy. So they were using VPNs to circumvent that. Secure their personal information. I mean, big tick. I don't really want my personal information hacked. Relative privacy online. Again, VPN is not going to be foolproof. If you want to be truly secretive online, there's a million people who will tell you much better than I, but you'd be using Tor and various other, security methods. You wouldn't be using a VPN that you pay 99 cents a month for or 0 cents a month for. And then again, free trade. So if you think about free trade, it can have innumerable meanings, but it could be as simple as watching Netflix in a country that doesn't have Netflix, or it could be something like, in countries where the trade agreements aren't so sweet, actually being able to pretend like you're living elsewhere and trade more freely with those countries. So, in summary, what it is more privacy, less traceability. It's a VPN. I'm nearly there. These are all the nodes. I started thinking in China and writing it down when I was on the toilet. And I started plotting all these nodes out and trying to work out what a VPN actually was, and if I was to try and describe a VPN and what it did, how I'd do that for my mum. And then I started thinking, well, what about if we could take the model of a VPN and combine it with properties of money? And so it could be used to combat censorship of finances. So I'm just using the same proof points as before, but I'm just putting finance in there. So secure personal transactions, afford you relative privacy, and also free trade. Well, I started thinking about that and said, what about virtual private money? So actually using an analogy that 1.6 billion people know, 1.6 billion people use in their day-to-day, for the exact same reasons as you would use a money which helped or afforded you relative privacy. And that sort of resonated with people. I went back to the bar and I said to Mr. Zhang, I said, would you use this? Oh yeah, I'd use that. I sampled a few other people who were a bit more inebriated, and then I started sampling with people on the bus. I was part of a delegation, and then I got home and I started talking to my friends, and then I put out a white paper and decided to release it, and it is being used by a lot of people. I won't go into that just now. But the map started to look like this, because I started thinking about MWeb, which is the technology I was referring to before, that no one really can explain in 5 minutes. But if I said to you, this technology will act like a VPN, but it's money. And it's called VPN, Virtual Private Money. It seemed like a lot more people actually understood what the benefits and use cases were. So, why would I use Litecoin? Well, firstly, I work for the foundation, but also Litecoin has activated the technology, and I just want the technology to be used. This service is not, I'm not getting any money for using for starting the service. I'm not taking a clip of any ticket or fee or whatever. I'm using Litecoin, and again I'm using Litecoin because it's a strong chain and because it's actually purpose-built for transactions. So VPN, is sort of where I've gotten to. We talked about, or I talked about, you guys nodded and some of you admitted to owning sex toys, but we talked about the need for privacy, digital privacy, financial privacy, even in Australia. And now I got to this point, which is the idea, which is VPM, virtual private money. It's decentralized, it's easy to use, and it's for anyone. I've written a white paper with a bunch of information on it, which you can find there. So if you want to go to www.vpm.run, excuse the website because I made it on the way to Nashville because I was excited to present the idea. And that's about it. That's framing up why we're all a bit fucked, screwed if CBDCs actually come into effect in Australia and globally. And our financial privacy is at risk. Are there any questions?